Well, joining me now is the director of polling for Harvard's Institute of Politics, Della Volpe, but he's also the author of a great Substack, JDV on Gen Z, and what he's really become is sort of this oracle, if you will, or at least some people view him as an oracle of trying to understand where Gen Z is going. And it's a developing, this is, if you think you've cracked the code on Gen Z today, just wait 24 hours. It'll change, and we're going to get into that. But, John, this is a good time to have you because you've both done some survey work in the last 6 months. And more importantly, we've gotten the final product of what happened in 2024. We've gotten all that data, and I know you've been able to consume all of that. So let's rewind the clock a little bit, all right? You had issued this warning about the youth vote going into Election Day 2024. You've now seen all the data. What did we miss in plain sight? And then let me say this. What do you think you ended up? Did you miss anything? As much as you were sort of on top of this,
Sure.
Was there even more that you may have missed? So we've got all of the answer keys now. Take me back. What have you learned since?
Well, again, thanks so much for having me, Chuck. To start with, there has been a perfect correlation in this century to when Democratic candidates for presidents win 60% of the youth vote, okay, they win the election. When Republicans nominees can keep them somewhere below 60% in the mid 50s, that is their ticket to the White House. Okay, so Donald.
It's not about turnout per se. It really is about how much of that group you win, not how much of that group turns out.
So there's a combination, but it's really about that top number, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And Barack Obama got 66% and then 60%, 08-12. Joe Biden got 60%, 61% 4 years ago, okay? And this cycle, Kamala Harris got somewhere in the mid 50s, okay? Call it 55, 56%. None of the post-election work is kind of perfect. So the question is it possible?
And what did Hillary Clinton get?
She got the same, 55, 56%. John Kerry got 54%. Al Gore got 51%. So, but
there you go.
The generic Democrat, Chuck, right? The generic Democrat starts in the mid 50s. Okay. So their job, okay, is to persuade basically kind of 10% to improve that number by about 10% to get to 59, 56%, right? And if Joe Biden could do it, okay, didn't have a record in 2020 of necessarily being close to the youth vote, I think virtually any modern Democrat could do that. The question is, why didn't that happen? Okay. Where were the drop-offs? How did we, and what was the pathway for Donald Trump? A couple things. Kamala Harris did less well among young men and young women than Joe Biden 4 years previous. Okay.
By the way, I'm glad you point this out about young women, because there's all been this obsession about, for instance, black men versus black women. But when I looked at the numbers, she didn't lose ground just among black men. She also lost ground among black women. She didn't lose ground just among Hispanic men. She also lost ground among Hispanic women. It was across the board she lost ground. It wasn't, you can't just sit here and say it was some gender specific thing in one age group, because that's not what the end game data has shown, now that everybody has taken the voter file and shown us what we've seen.
And by the way, in Catalyst and their post-election report in terms of the voter file said it was not a turnout issue. Okay. It was, virtually similar turnout than 2020. It's that they chose a different pathway, and we should get into why they chose what they chose. Okay. But yeah, there's a ceiling, I think, for Democrats with younger women in the mid 60s, and 2 or 3 points makes a significant difference. But the thing that I believe is unforgivable, Chuck, for Democrats is what happened among younger men. Okay. Because in my view, and we had talked about this, I'd written about it on the Substack. I wrote about it, a week or so, 10 days out, for the New York Times, is that this issue with younger men, this issue among people with color had been developing for months, if not years. I believe Donald Trump looked at the data in 2020, 2021, realizing that if he was going to win back the presidency, he needed to kind of expand his electorate, and made younger men a significant focus of that. In just the last couple of months, of the last cycle, he spent over $20 million communicating with younger men, on top of, the millions and millions of dollars he and his aligned forces have kind of invested. And that what that amounted to was a 10-point decrease, okay, among young Black men, from basically 75, 10-point decrease from 85 to 75% support for Democrats, a 16 point decrease among young Hispanic men, a 4-point decrease among young whites, a 6-point decrease among young Asian American Pacific Islander men. So just across the board. And again, as we said, it wasn't just that 18 to 29-year-old bracket, similar, but not as substantial, I think, decreases.
You know what that looks like?
Other age
You know what I've told people? The split on ethnicity and race between Trump and Harris looked almost identical to Bush Kerry 04.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
On Latinos and on Black folks,
especially exactly right. So the idea of demographics are not destiny. So, you need to constantly invest. And my takeaway right after the election, and I feel even stronger about it now, is that, to me, it's not a debate about should the party go further to the left or closer to the right or to the center. It's a question of they need to get closer to the people, right? Yeah, they need to listen and to get closer, not left and not right, get closer. And unless you're constantly investing in that listening, then I think the party is going to have a hard time getting its footing and moving past this.
Is it possible that Barack Obama just created an outlier coalition for himself that Joe Biden borrowed for one election very successfully, just in the same way George H.W. Bush borrowed the Reagan coalition for one election and it didn't sustain, right? Democrats couldn't sustain it. Because what is interesting to me is, and I've always believed that, have Democrats, quote unquote, lost support among Black voters, or did Black voters temporarily support Barack Obama in greater numbers? And then when the choices were no longer about essentially, making sure the first Black president, wasn't mistreated, by the American electorate, that, hey, guess what? There's always been 15 to 20% of the Black vote that has leaned right. And Democrats overperformed with those voters because of Barack Obama. And now that he's not really a part of the conversation, they went back to their natural home ideologically, which is the Republican Party.
Well, I also think, and the thing that keeps me, so curious, is that every cycle, Chuck, right, we have a new cohort of young people, right, who are bringing their own experiences. So while there are still some extremely loyal folks, right, Democrats within the African American and Black community, it doesn't mean their kids, their grandkids are going to be loyal, right? And they often tell me that that their parents and their grandparents have voted one particular way for Democrats for the entire generation, and now they're looking at how has that loyalty, what are the dividends of that loyalty, right? And what do the public schools look like in those communities, right? What are the housing opportunities in those? What are the healthcare, kind of opportunities? And they're basically saying we're going to turn out if we believe authentically that the candidate is speaking to them, right, and can make a tangible difference in their lives. And it's just not kind of this automatic support, part of the machine politics that perhaps their parents or grandparents, and that Obama was obviously able to leverage that plus some, right, in 08 and 12.
There was another thesis pre-election that young voters might be moved on the abortion issue. It turned out not to be true, did it?
No, it was true in 2022. Okay. It was true in the midterm election. And I think that one of the most significant miscalculations, perhaps, right, of pundits or advisors or who ranking follow whoever, right, was that was going to be a deciding factor, as you said. And it was the first town hall meeting I did with my students. We spent a weekend in Michigan in the springtime, about 15 or 16 months ago or so. That issue kind of came up, and the young people in that kind of town hall meeting, Chuck, were telling us that was almost a luxury, okay? Reproductive
Mm.
health access, okay? Where it fell to kind of a second tier behind the cost of living, which translates to whether or not you can keep your home,
John, this
okay?
isn't
Right?
new. This isn't new analysis, right? Which is we've
No.
known this forever. Which is when the economy sucks, cultural issues take a back seat. When the economy is going well, cultural issues become front and center. And it is, that was a true as, our brains, I always joke that a lot of our brains have been rotted by Trump, right?
Mhm.
We think so many things have changed because of Trump. There's still some political truisms that have been true for decades. And the relationship between cultural issues being a voting issue versus economic issues almost entirely are about the perception of the economy. And if it's fairly positive, then the biggest issues will be,
Yes.
cultural issues.
Yes, or education or other things.
Right.
100%. And what young women told me in the final weeks when we would conduct our focus groups and our surveys with specifically kind of younger women who are still kind of on the fence in terms of whether they're going to turn out and for whom, they let me know quite clearly that they were intelligent enough to know that even with Kamala Harris' victory, okay, it didn't mean that the reproductive health was guaranteed, the next day or the next month. Okay, that had been an issue that was litigated in the courts before and based upon where you live, et cetera. But they were really focused on housing policy, right? On the
Mm-hmm.
economic policy, on healthcare, mental health. That's what they were looking for. And I think that was certainly kind of one of the things that was missed in a lot of the kind of the pre-election analysis
Yeah.
um, that I found.
Well, let's fast forward. We're 6 months in, and in fact, I spent a part of my Monday episode just talking about the CBS YouGov poll, and I'm not a huge fan of YouGov in general on their methodology. I can get into long-term reasons why, but that said, they have a trend line, and to
Mm.
me, even if you don't agree with a poll's methodology, as long as their methodology doesn't change, you can learn a lot through trend lines, and this is why I'm a fan more of if really give me your trend line and I can learn a lot. The trend line is unmistakable here. And
Mhm.
that is, and frankly, it isn't just among Gen Z where there's disapproval on cost of living. This is across the board. And here's Donald Trump, who, on one hand, has had the most successful start, particularly of a second term president, that anybody's
Mhm.
had in Washington, arguably going back to FDR. And yet, it is not translated at all. If anything, his numbers have gotten worse because the number one issue that they're disappointed in is cost of living. It's still, and here's the thing: is housing costs up or down? We know what it is. Is the price of groceries going up or down? We know the answer. Is the price of goods in Walmart essentially up or down?
Mhm.
There you go.
There it is. And there is less, so therefore that creates less stability in our families, in our
Mm-hmm.
lives because of economic stress. And clearly there is less stability across America because of increasing levels of political division, because of many of the other acts, as well as kind of around the world, right?
And who's got
And
less
we can.
pad? And who's got less pad right now?
Mhm,
Right?
mhm,
A boomer has a lot of pad. Gen X has some pad. Even older millennials have some pad. Not
mhm.
Gen Z.
No, and when I say, when I'll give the counter to, the stock market is still up X percent, 8, 10, 12%. I said, that's good for people who have money in the stock market, right?
Right.
Or they'll say, when I talk to the younger Trump supporters, I'll make the opposite case earlier in the year. They'll say, we don't care about the stock market because A, we don't have a lot, and B, we're going to be in it for 40 years. Okay. They're looking for those kind of direct, kind of tangible benefits in terms of where are you on what was promised to us.
Mm-hmm.
um, and um, and I think that's where it is. The YouGov, as I said, it's the youth sample. Regardless of the methodology, has been consistent,
It's
and his
consistent, and
approval
that's what
rating
I'm. Yeah.
is actually 28% among younger people, among younger
Mm-hmm.
folks under 30, which is as low as I've seen it with any group. And we're going back to see, that divide, which is that like that millennial Gen Z versus Gen X and Boomer divide. I think most of the country, he's underwater. He's doing probably,
Mm-hmm.
8-10 points better among the older cohorts than the younger cohorts. It's a similar phenomenon that we saw, I think, in 2017, 2018, right? The blowback. Yeah.
It's interesting that, in trying to put I'm never sure where to put Gen X, because I feel like half of Gen
Mm.
X behaves like boomers and half of Gen X behaves like older millennials, right? Like it's such a small generation that they almost get consumed by the two big ones on either
Yeah.
side of them, particularly when it comes to marketing. There is no marketing to Gen X, right? You're either marketing to boomers with money or you're marketing to millennials with money. And the assumption is that they scoop up Gen X. But I'm curious about the millennial Gen Z alliance and then divide. Where we know where they align, where do they divide?
I think so again, for the listeners, in terms of the electorate today, Gen Z is folks basically 18 to 29, 18, 20, 18, 29. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So millennials now, 29, 30, up to the early 40s. To me, the single easiest way to think about is someone a millennial or someone a Gen Z is, do you remember 9/11?
Right.
Okay. Because if you've got that memory of 9/11,
Mm-hmm.
at least for a couple of moments, you recognized that regardless of whether we lived in a red or a blue county, that we all kind of connected with each other as Americans,
Mm-hmm.
and we displayed our patriotism and support of our fellow citizens, and we seem to be connected. Gen Z has never had that moment. Okay, this is a generation
Oh,
where
they've
they
had the
feel like
moment, but it's not been a unity moment. They've had
no,
national moments, right? The
they've
election
had
of
national
Trump was
moments.
a moment. The COVID was a moment. The
Oh
January
yeah.
6th was a moment, but these are not unifying moments, right? These are in many ways divisive moments.
And those are the moments that shape their values.
Yeah.
Okay, where time and time again they have felt betrayed by the institutions designed to protect them and give them a basis to live their best life. So I think there is a lot politically that I think they kind of align with, but really
Mm.
understanding, Chuck, the impact that COVID had on this generation of Gen Zers. We're
Yeah.
still trying to kind of assess that. A series of headlines from the Harvard Youth Poll, talked about 5 years later, the degree to which young people are still searching for community,
Yeah.
and those who are searching most deeply, we can see the impact they have on their mental health today. And we
Yeah.
can also see the degree to which they're open to strongman authoritarian messages as well. So I think really kind of unpacking that's almost a third of their lifetime,
Right.
in terms of what their memory is like. It's a
Well,
really important part.
look, I'm all about coming of age moments, and I do think they define a generation, right, in different ways. And
Mm.
and so there's no doubt that COVID is going to be this, um, you know, COVID is going to be a defining moment for Gen Z. And I'm curious, have you started to track the divide among Gen Z, on those that lived in a state where they had to do remote school versus those that lived in a state where they got to go to school? And have you been able
Um,
to, is it enough? I guess, is it doable? I know in one
yeah,
poll it might not be, but is this something you
yeah,
might be able to accumulate over, say, a year's worth of? Because I really
yeah.
want to see that distinction. I really want to understand that distinction better.
Yeah, that's a good question. We can dig deeper into that. There's obviously other variables in terms of like republic, like a lot of the states are southern states,
Well, because
whereas
we're
more
seeing,
right.
well, the reason I ask this, and I say
Yeah,
this, I have two kids in Southern schools, okay, and went
yeah,
to go, and they're not alone, right? All of
mm,
my son's friends, and this is a very unusual, he went to, he went to a private school,
hmm
and I can't tell you how many. This is the first time this private school sent a kid to SMU, or sent multiple kids to Tulane, or sent a kid to
hmm
Georgia Tech or Clemson or Georgia. This is DC, man. They're used to going north on
mm,
995,
hmm
not
hmm
south
hmm
on 995. And
hmm
all this class was more interested in going south or west than they were
hmm
going north or Midwest. And it's anecdotal, but I'm
yeah,
curious. It certainly feels, we all know the southern states were quote unquote open, right? The
right,
northern
right.
states weren't.
Right. And also I don't know, perhaps like I think that's an important thing to unpack and understand. And also, there is perhaps a high quality of life because you're open, but also cost of living, right? And the cost
Right.
of some of those universities in the South, those bigger universities, are going to perhaps be more affordable for parents as well as
You
students
wouldn't
after the
believe what
fact.
they charge
Right?
at Auburn for out of state. Sorry.
That's right.
I'm sitting here
That's right.
thinking the same
So,
thing. And you're
right?
like,
I don't
wait,
know.
what? I thought this was going to be a discount. I don't have anybody at Auburn, but Auburn was on one
Yeah.
of the lists of one of my
Yeah.
kids. And I remember thinking like,
Yeah.
oh, this is going to be a nope.
Yeah.
they've all
It's still, yeah.
they've all
Yeah.
priced nationally.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah. Yeah.
But you're not wrong about the cost of living part. Okay.
Yeah.
And how to live around in those neighborhoods. I mean, think about Cambridge versus Auburn, Alabama.
Yeah. Well, and it's not just that aspect of it. Is I think that one of the differences between kind of the Gen Z versus the millennial cohort is Gen Z may be the first who really in their bones realizes that they won't do as well as their parents. Okay. That the idea of a house, okay, may be out of reach. Okay. So therefore, what I think Gen Z, and perhaps this is kind of connected to the interesting movement south, is that it allows you to perhaps have a fuller, richer experience doing the things that they want to do kind of around the calendar year. Okay. They
Mm-hmm.
put more emphasis on spending time outside. They put more emphasis on some of that community building, which often is more accessible again if you're in a warmer, if it's in a warmer climate, for their own mental health. Time and time again, when I'm doing focus groups, whether it's in Florida or whether it's in Colorado, when I ask people what's a good day, younger people, they're telling me that experience to kind of go outside,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's a
Yeah.
way to kind of mitigate some against some of the stress. So there could be something around that as well.
You know, is it coincidental that Taylor Swift uh, has some of the biggest draws and Gen Z traveled to go see her concerts? How much of COVID pent up COVIDness may have actually helped that? Because I've had some people point out that, hey, this is another distinction here. You know, Gen Z wants to get out from their phone, okay, wants to go be with each other. And hey, the Taylor Swift success, yes, she herself is popular, so you can't take that part of it. But the fact that there was tailgating, the fact that there were so many, you had local hotels. My daughter was one of them who traveled to go see a Taylor Swift, and that it had real world effects on local economies, which a concert tour never had before. Okay. Usually you waited till it
Yeah,
came to
you
your
said
area.
fact.
Right.
Right.
And the fact that you had that, you know, and I guess, you know, we can't now, I wish we were thinking about it then, but I wonder how much COVID had an impact on that.
That is, I think, a brilliant insight. And it's an example of people are just searching for that, searching so hard for that community.
That's a
And
community. Yes,
that
a
is a
powerful
community,
community.
right?
Yeah.
Yes. And it's just not that experience too of being in the same place, but you know, of course, every time she drops an album, right? Like the first 11 songs are usually kind of in the top 20, right? Of that, right? So it's also an online community. It's one of those few places, right? Where you have both
That's figured
sides of
out
it.
how to be both, right? Live and in
Right.
person, using it's sort of like, you know, whatever I think what a lot of creators are striving for. Hey, can I do what
Right.
Taylor Swift did? Take an
Yeah.
online audience and make them real people.
Right. And why? Right. Because you know, my girls are now in their 20s. We took them to Foxborough Stadium,
Yeah.
right? You know,
Yeah.
probably 15 years ago, right? And I don't know, you know, but I think they feel heard. Okay. I think that even, you know, whether you're 15 or 35, that you can feel connected to Taylor Swift, right? In that community. And that is when we have a transcendent artist, and that is when we see transcendent elected officials, right? Obama, obviously, Trump to some degree, of course, right, within
Right.
his communities, and with the election in New York City, it's the same thing. It's like when people feel heard, they come together, and it's joyous, and I don't think it's that hard. I don't think it's that hard.
Well, let's transition to something you've been involved in, which is this idea of you know, how can Democrats, quote unquote, are searching for their own Joe Rogan, which of course the joke is, well, they had Joe Rogan until they didn't have Joe Rogan.
Right.
And here we are talking about all these organic ways these things work versus manufacturing them. Can you manufacture this, or does it have to be organic? Is it more of how you conduct yourself versus who you find as an influencer?
Yeah, I mean, so you can't manufacture it. You can't manufacture it, but like with organic, you can feed it, right? You can nurture it, so it
So
begins to
curse.
kind
So by cursing, I mean, I'm sorry, I sort of laugh at the idea. Geez, if you just say the F word more, all right, John, we're just going to say F bomb this and F bomb that, and suddenly we're appealing to Gen Z. Come on, like that felt like that feels silly.
No, so I mean, I think here's what Trump did. And listen, Chuck, I spent like dozens and dozens and dozens of hours, okay, with Gen Z, specifically Gen Z men.
A lot of focus groups, right?
Okay.
You did
a lot of
ton
focus groups. We did a ton of focus groups, and I didn't break them out based upon ideology or party ID. It's based upon these lived and shared experiences, okay. And what I heard time and time again was that during that critical time, we talked about COVID, during that critical time where younger women, again, incredibly challenging for everyone, but young women went into COVID with slightly stronger communities, whether it's a Taylor Swift community or the relationship with their mom or their teacher. They had slightly more social capital moving in than younger men did who were teenagers, okay? Number one, younger men spent more time online, came out more isolated. That's just a kind of a fact. And when they spent
Isn't
time
it their
online,
coming of age? Is it the coming of age experience? The fact that we're at a time where men were being pushed aside for women
that's a big part of it.
in the workplace, and what were they seeing and calculating? I mean, I know the impact it had on my son in what his goals and ambitions are and what industry he's decided he has a better shot at advancing in versus industries that he thinks are not going to be interested in a white male.
Well, that's certainly already happening there, like in the post Me Too environment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then again, the lack of like younger men are slightly takes a little bit longer for us to mature, right? Than our counterparts.
I'm still trying, right?
Right,
Yeah.
we are. And so that was just kind of part of it. And then a lot of them had important questions. And when you're isolated and when you're not talking to teachers or mentors or coaches or even each other, you're spending time online, and that is where you are introduced to the influencers, okay? And what Donald Trump, I think, and again, kind of the aligned MAGA forces is to begin to develop relationships, right?
Mm-hmm.
With influences outside of politics, right? Whether it's fitness folks, do-it-yourself folks, right? Whether it's
UFC was a huge part of this, wasn't it?
college wrestling, you could go on, right? Music, comedy, YouTube, et cetera, right? So again, just beginning to show up, right? Where younger men were kind of spending time. So that is, I think, partially organic, right? But also part of our strategy, but it's a different kind of strategy, right? You're not dropping a few $1 million on 30-second ads, right? You're actually investing in time, sharing information, et cetera. So, so Democrats could certainly do, I think, kind of a better job with that. I think that they are. I think we see, even the last several months, you see, not to leave anybody out, but you see Pete Buttigieg, right, with Andrew Schultz. You see Gretchen Whitmer talking about younger men who are scared of the state. You see Governor Moore, so many others kind of engaging in these kinds of Cory Booker on gaming platforms, et cetera. So that's kind of part one. Okay, part one, showing up, kind of where they are when you're comfortable, and then the second part, I think, is understanding that young men, by and large, have grown up expected to be and wanting to be the provider. Okay. We can debate it, but it's just what younger men are telling us. Okay. And it's happened for generations, if not for centuries. And it's really challenging to feel good about yourself as a provider for others. Maybe it's your parents, if you're Hispanic Latino in Nevada. Maybe it's a partner or spouse. Maybe it's your community. Okay. But when you can't provide for yourself, okay, when you can't hit that point in your life where you feel like, you should be able to afford a home, that hurts. It cuts at your identity. and it makes you feel vulnerable and I think more open to strongman messages, what Trump is delivering. But you need
You're
to have
also
that
explaining to
connection
me why crypto's so popular among Gen Z.
right?
Yeah, because they're
And right,
looking to like, hey, I need to get mine in
right,
order to start out in life. Yeah,
because the other institutions have failed them,
right.
right? And that's exactly why.
You brought up the provider, which triggered. It's funny. Like when I wanted to book you, like I was like, I got to book John. Is when I read your Substack where you outlined the 10 archetypes of Gen Z, of Gen Z men, actually. The provider you just talked about, the skeptic, the stoic, the worker, the anchor, and then in emerging voices, the protector, the scroller, the silenced, the builder, the outsider. Anyway, I love this because it was sort of what you were thinking about it, frankly, politically, as well as culturally. And you can see, I think the second part is more of how to create political messaging to talk to those folks. And the first part is sort of understanding Gen Z culturally. All right, I ran down the list. Tell me where my listeners should focus. What are the 2 or 3 of those archetypes that you think truly will help you understand this group of men better?
So the reason I did those archetypes, Chuck, and more similar research coming out very soon on the Substack, is because listen, this project got
Subscribe
mocked.
now, JDV on Gen Z,
Subscribe,
right? Yeah,
right?
there you
But
go.
this project got widely mocked, okay, by
Right.
many Democrats who said, "I'll save you the time, I'll save you the money, give me a 6-pack of beer, or walk me into a sports bar." Okay, and oftentimes I find that people mock what they don't understand. Okay. And yes, we saw, as we talked about at the outset, a significant shift away from Democrats to Republicans. But it's not because everyone is coming at this in the exact same way. Okay. So for example, we talked about that provider feels like abandoned by the institutions, okay, and is opening themselves towards populism. Okay, we can
Yep.
see that I think reflected in some of the more popular sports podcasters. Okay, the skeptic is really interesting. Okay, we talked about I think the skeptic earlier, Chuck, when I talked about the younger African American boys, younger men. Okay, who said, you know what, I've been watching what's happening in my community, my parents, my grandparents. I don't like Republicans. I'm not sure Democrats have our back. Okay.
Yeah, my grandfather's been telling me, been fighting for better schools. My father's been fighting for better schools. We still need better schools. What the hell have
Okay.
the Democrats done for us?
Right.
I
Right.
I understand that. It's multi-generational.
Right. The worker. Okay. The hustler, the kid who's into crypto, he's got a great job. He's got picking up 2 or 3 other things. Okay. He's working as hard as he can. He has a college education. Okay. But he still can't get ahead. Okay. He can't get as far ahead as his dad. Okay. Who was a blue collar guy who painted houses. Okay. But
Right.
could still afford a home and raise a family with kids who went to college. Okay.
Mm.
The point is, we can go through a couple more, but unless you can like connect with these folks early on these shared experiences, it's
Yeah.
difficult to rebuild trust. Okay, and have that conversation about why your policy is better than the other. Just one or two other ones I think that
Mhm.
we're talking about is like the scroller. Okay, this
Mm.
is someone right who is often because I can think about these people that could have been in
I
my
love this. You
focus
call
groups,
it. Let
right?
me
Right?
do the descriptor you
Yeah,
had. Digitally isolated, algorithmically shaped. Against my will, I see so many Andrew Tate videos, was a quote from one of your, I think, focus
yeah.
groups. Consuming extremist content passively, may not even realize they've drifted, using credible peers to disrupt feeds, replace rather than scold.
Yeah, because it's not social media isn't just content, it's conditioning. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So like all of us who want to connect, again, it's just not a political thing for me, right? It's about like mental health and being good community members and strengthening our democracy. Because unless these folks feel heard, they don't participate in democracy. And this is to me what really drives me every single day. This project at Harvard started about turnout, right? Only a
Mm-hmm.
third of young people turned out in '96, Clinton Dole, right? And now, thankfully, we've got over half on a routine basis. But to me,
Mm-hmm.
it's about turnout and being heard. And the scroller is examples of like
Hmm.
They want to be heard. They want to, like, they're having these conversations on gaming platforms now. Okay. I appreciate that there's an element of young people that if you want to find them, that's where you need to find them online. Right.
Yeah, I saw AOC every once in a while, right? Will play games and show up
Yeah.
on Twitch and
Yeah.
have conversations. She's the only one I've noticed that organically does it. I haven't seen a lot of examples of sort of that high level of a political actor doing that.
For years, I've been struck by the simplicity. She does like an end of the year roundup,
Mhm.
that I see wherever on Instagram, where she just talk about the things that she's accomplished and the impact it's made. There's nothing preventing, other folks who care about democracy, who care about talking to young people for doing the same thing.
Mhm. I imagine you've become uh, more scholarly on generations and how different generations form and
Mm.
how their political identities form. I've obsessed with it. I subscribe to the book by Strauss, and
Mhm.
that idea that there's four archetypes, and we sort of cycle through. And if you believe that, Gen Z, I think, would be greatest generation, right? I think if would be the um,
Mhm.
and there are some similarities, right? Great Depression was a the Great Recession arguably is a formative period. Um, Questioning the relationship with government, at the time, people don't realize that was happening. And FDR and the New Deal was a radical idea at the time.
Mhm. Mhm.
To radically increase the size of government. That came in part, arguably due to that. Um, do you subscribe to that thesis that Gen Z is going to be a transformational generation politically, more so, it's sort of like that greatest generation was transformational, not necessarily created the leadership class arguably for two generations, but sort of
Mm.
reframed
Yeah.
politics for America, for
And,
basically the rest of the 20th century.
it was a different time, but also their parents sacrificed deeply. The silent generation sacrificed deeply, right,
Hmm.
for the greatest generation. And I
Hmm.
think that, um, we talked about Gen X a little bit, being, parents of Gen Z, the cost of education, some of these other things. There's a lot of sacrifice, which is putting a lot of pressure on Gen Z now with the
Hmm.
sandwich generation. But yes, because despite the fact that they are losing faith in institutions, they're still participating at higher numbers at this age cohort than
Hmm.
any previous generation in electoral politics. They have not, and one of the really optimistic things that comes out of the research is, while they may feel cynical about what's happening in Washington, I don't think they've given up on their communities. I think they're looking for opportunities to kind of see each other and to help each other. So
That's
I
interesting
am,
you say that.
yeah,
There's
yeah,
another more negative version that I ascribe to this, which is you talked about 96 and the super low turnout among young
yeah,
voters.
yeah.
Is there a more peace and prosperity election that we've had in our lifetime than 1996?
Right,
Right? Where
right.
it's sort of peak influence of America, peak power, like the tech boom is just beginning. I mean, my God, it is literally the peace and prosperity election. How do we know this? The entire conversation was about culture, right? That was the
Mm-hmm.
entire, right? They couldn't really hit him on the economy. They just hit him on culture and in character, because it was a true peace and prosperity election. So yes, turnout was down. There's been this uncomfortable realization that I've had that here we've had four of our highest turnouts in my lifetime in these last two midterms and two presidentials. And it has been when there have been questions about the future of democracy, right, have
Mm-hmm.
been sort of at the center of the conversation. And I guess, do we feel better that the more people think is at stake, the more likely they are to vote? And the less that they think is at stake, the less likely they are to vote. Should we take comfort in that or not? You see where I'm going, right?
Yeah, I have to I'm an optimist. I have to take comfort in that because I'm I appreciate the fact that this generation, I think with millennials, realize that so much is at stake, and it needs to be a public and private series of solutions to kind of
Mhm.
to get us there. And they may not even believe that they'll be able to own a home in the place where they grew up, but I don't think they're willing to give up on America. I don't think they're willing to give up, kind of on their futures and their children's futures through their work. But so I think, and we've seen examples of this. We saw again. I go back to what we saw in New York City. And the lesson from New York City isn't that, I don't think that democratic socialism is going to sweep America. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. The lesson from New York City is younger people, new coalitions of younger men, of white voters, of younger voters turn out when they feel heard, right?
Mm-hmm.
When there's a campaign focused on listening and not lecturing. Okay. So if we're able to find candidates who aspire to that, I think that Gen Z can be that transformative generation.
It's
hopefully
funny.
hopefully not in terms of obviously the significant sacrifices overseas, but domestically.
Listening, not lecturing, triggered a question. There's another Substack out there, and I was talking about you before, and I know you're familiar with Young Men Research Initiative.
Yeah,
it's a sort of a side project of a gentleman that I've does some other things, and he did his own. It was some other. I think he bought some YouGov access to the YouGov sampling, and the big conclusion he came from is Gen Z basically loves Bernie and hates woke. It was sort of this essentially saying, hey, this is these young men are culturally conservative and economically liberal.
Well, I will put a little bit more nuance in that.
Mm-hmm.
Is that there are aspects of Republicans who are more conservative who are following Trump. Okay. But I think the point of the listening, not lecturing, is we need to give younger people, specifically younger men, some space, with some of these cultural issues, okay, to let them come up kind of based upon their own experiences, kind of with their own decisions. And that's what I find when I go to the South, right? There's a different environment if you're growing up in a more conservative, perhaps more religious household, that sometimes you just need more space to figure out what, your view is on transgender bathrooms or medical procedures, etc. And too often, what happens is when they ask someone who they think has thought more about this, sometimes they feel mocked. Sometimes they see that eye roll, right? And rather than giving them the kind of the grace to help them think through it themselves, they feel some disdain from someone else who might be, quote, more woke, and that again takes them into a place that's not constructive.
No, they feel shamed. I mean, look,
a lot of shame.
I think a lot of parents of Gen Z men have had, if they're close with their kids, their sons will explain to them a moment when they have felt this way.
Shame.
I know,
shame is one of the
and
unifiers.
that shame feeling and being shocked, it literally was asking a question in class where it was encouraged to ask, and then suddenly felt mocked and shamed and singled out. And, it's the experience that, let's just say, it translates to, geez, if I was another demographic group, there would be a bunch of people rallying around me as a victim. But because I'm in this demographic group, I get no grace.
The number of times I hear that, right, from parents of children or from younger people themselves is countless. But here's the political side of that. Okay, is that when I ask younger people about the ones who voted for Trump, why, they see strength in Republicans, they see weakness in Democrats. One of the ways in which a young person sees strength is by someone like Charlie Kirk, okay, who is not afraid to show up at a place that will often be hostile, like a college campus, and take any question from anyone. They don't necessarily need to agree, but they see strength in having that conversation and that debate, or that discussion. I think that is one of the things that kind of connects them with the Rogans, the Theo Vons, and others, right? It's not their ideology. I think their ideology is independent. We can see a significant, by the way, shift, Chuck, right? Theo Von questioning what's happening in the Middle East. Joe Rogan, giving platforms to Democrats. Andrew Schultz talking about the party who most sees Americans a Democratic Socialist Party. Okay. So they appreciate, right, the openness of those kinds of conversations. And that's strength. And that's something that Democrats need to understand and be more open to longer form conversations.
You're not just become this expert on Gen Z. You started this poll in 96, which means really you've watched millennials go from non-voters to become mature, sort of arguably the dominant. Correct me if I'm wrong. Did they overtake boomers in 24 for total vote?
Sorry, millennials. Yes. Yes.
That's what I thought. Right.
Yep.
So we now, and this is an important moment, correct me, right? Which is millennials and Gen Z are more than half the electorate now?
Not quite
of actual voting, or not there yet?
Not quite in actual voting. Maybe 40%.
By 28? Do you think by 28 it will be? Should the 28 presidential candidates assume that voters under 50 will outnumber voters over 50, or no?
I think under 50, I think yes. Okay. But here's the thing. The voters over 50, they pretty much know where they're going to vote right now. Okay. Yeah. They don't change that much, right?
Right.
They don't change that much.
When do they develop that habit? Have you figured that out? Is there an age?
Yeah, is it? Yeah. So, well, I think so much of it, if you kind of agree with that generational theory, Chuck, so much of it is in this teenage, early 20-something kind of experience that you carry. These are values.
Gen X. Yeah. I'm obsessed with this, right? Because my demographic group, you
can say our, I think
our demographic group is very pro-Trump. White men over 50, right? Between 50 and 65. Yeah. This is Gen X, not boomer. Gen X, it's right. Well, who was the president of where we truly understood? Well, Reagan. We are the children of Reagan.
Yep.
Right. I look at, millennials, and in many ways they grew up with Bill Clinton, right? That was their childhood memory of a president. My parents, their childhood memory of a president was Eisenhower. Right. So that's why they're more soft R's really than I think hard R's, which boomers have proven out to be. They really are pretty 50-50 generation, aren't they? That ultimately the boomers have stayed fairly 50-50 the entire, they move back and forth a little bit. But if you look at it and back again, if anything, they lean slightly left, right?
Exactly. And what I think a lot of strategists don't get, and this is the reason that we started this Harvard poll 25 years ago. So the first poll was in 2000, is because it's really hard. You can't model. Okay. We talk about all these analytics rooms. Okay. You can't model behavior that hasn't happened yet. Okay. So you need to understand the 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old and that experience. And this is where I think too many Democrats took it for granted. This experience under Biden, okay, it's fundamentally different than the previous experience from 2020, which was under Trump. Okay. Right. And they just assumed, like we talked about, it was going to be a replay of 2022 and not really listening. I talked to someone recently who kind of worked inside one of those analytics operations, and they told me it's really hard to get people to answer the door when you're door knocking with younger people. It doesn't mean you have to give up. It means you have to work harder to listen and to find them and to engage, right? And again, it's not to me about Democrats or Republicans. It's about democracy. We need to.
Well, here we are. So Gen Z is going to be shaped by Trump for a generation, for 2 generations. And I think we don't fully, with boomers, right? You had both Eisenhower and Kennedy in many ways sort of shaped, Nixon was their polarizing president. If anything, right? And it was sort of and I could argue that it is sort of that fight between the jocks and the feminists, right? And the nerds, right? In the late 60s, early 70s, continues, right? And you could argue Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were literally, the president of the student council versus the captain of the football team. That was I'm fascinated to see how Gen Z and what this means over the next 25 years of Gen Z politically. Do they gravitate to strong candidates no matter whether they're left or right? Right. But it's more of the strong, because that is what they know. It's the strong man politics. That's what they know right now. And I think it's more formative. It's going to end up being more formative to them than I think we fully appreciate, if the same way, that Clinton was, Clinton and Democrats were seen as a net positive with millennials growing up. For you, our generation, it was Reagan, et cetera.
If if it's not countered. Okay. My biggest concern is what Trump is doing to these institutions, right? Not only is it gutting them, but in terms of like the public attitudes about restoring that. But yeah, the question is, to me, is this a moment or is this a trend? And it could be a moment or it could be a trend unless it's countered by strength in a different kind of strength on the other side that hears you. Again, I think there are local examples of this around the country, and I think as we hit the midterm cycle, it will be an indication. It will clearly be backlash like there was in 2018.
Oh, yeah.
But we'll see what develops from that.
Look,
and the dozen or so candidates who are looking at this from the Democratic side.
If you want to be conventional, bet on change, right? And you actually usually won't go wrong. Let me get you out of here on this. We talked about how you started this at the beginning of Millennials. You've now gone through. Let me ask you this: when does the last Gen Zer turn 18?
Yeah, so 2050. We're getting a couple more years. 2030. I think it's
okay. So
a few more years.
Do you feel like it's a little soon to understand Gen Alpha yet?
I do. I do. Yes.
Okay.
They're in grade
So we
school.
still got about the rest of this decade to get all of Gen Z into the electorate. We still got a few more.
The oldest Gen Alpha kids are they're still thinking about middle school. Okay. And that's
where do we begin Gen Alpha? Is that 20? I saw you say 2015. Is that approximately where you're going?
I think that's when the first Gen Alpha right around then,
So they'll have no memory of Barack Obama.
No,
that's an important, right. That just happens. Look, hey, Father Time is undefeated. It just happens. That's interesting.
Yeah. And their experience, those younger ones, those experience with Donald Trump will be quite different, especially as it happens over the next couple of years. Right. So,
well, when does you usually do an incoming freshman? Do you do an incoming freshman survey? Is that coming soon?
That we are organizing. We're going to be investing more, I think, in listening and focus groups. So we have some focus groups we'll be doing here at Harvard this fall. And in an odd year, we're not going to release the first survey until early December. Okay. So we won't be doing the incoming freshman survey. Our survey, that's another university. We'll be doing the 18 to 29-year-old cohort. And that will come out. We've got some time for that. Will come out in early December, about a year out from the midterms.
Well, John, you are persistent, and I think your work has proven to be extraordinarily important. And I think it's funny when I think about how my peers treated covering young voters, and sort of, there was a stigma. Well, you don't have to bother. They don't turn out, which was true until it wasn't.
Exactly. Yep. And because they weren't heard, they weren't listened to. So that's what we try to do at Harvard. We try to give the opportunity to give no excuses. If you want to reach them, this is what they care about. That's it.
All right. John Della Volpe. Let's see. You can subscribe to this. They don't even have to pay, do they? It's a free Substack?
It's a free Substack. There's some stuff that's archived.
Yeah.
You take tips. We take tips, and I got a lot of other research. Outside of Harvard, I'm investing in my own research. So I do appreciate, those who do subscribe and support it. And it's all good. We're just trying to give voice to as many people as we can.
Well, as you know, I'm an avid reader. I hope you saw that based on how many times I wanted to go back to stuff that you did. Great stuff. Good to check in with you. I want to do this again. Hopefully when your next poll's out.
Love it.
We'll go from there. All right, John.
Thanks, John.